Section 1. How the Christian missionaries became the horrifying and ungrateful guests. Sadly, this terrible behavior of these early Christian missionaries was not an accident. It was the result of long and well-established elitist and discriminatory practices within the medieval church. It began when the church elevated learned people who were well-versed in philosophy and higher learning to leadership positions. Many of these learned leaders of the church began arguing and writing to justify the existence of Christianity as being superior to other religions. Also, once the church gained political recognition and power in the Roman Empire, the church began resembling the world instead of being the community where God's reign took place. It became arrogant and self-serving. Its leaders became no different than kings and queens of countries around them. They were concerned more on consolidating their wealth, privilege, and power than about people. They looked down on ordinary people in the church as nothing more than tools they could exploit and use at their pleasure. After establishing themselves as rulers, they began classifying and segmenting people in their villages, cities, and countries. Those who were Christians were seen as on higher ranking than Jews and foreigners of other religions. They discriminated based on race and religion, of course within their own Christian circles. They also discriminated based on preferences, prejudices, and differences according to social status. Sadly, these discriminations were justified by theologians as well as church leadership. In the Middle Ages, as the political power increased, the church established these discriminations as part of its normative teaching. In the same way as they began discovering and conquering other continents and people, they established churches in these colonies in the images of their colonial masters. They transplanted to the colonies not only their institutions, but also their prejudices, hatred, and bigotry of discrimination. They used racial discrimination as one of the tools to keep the colonial subjects under control. The missionaries went to the colonies not as guests, but as conquering soldiers of God. They forced their ways and demanded tributes rather than being welcomed and humbly sharing. In colonial churches, white male missionaries were the top leaders who enjoyed wealth, privileges, and power. They treated locals with much disdain, in much the same way the Pharisees treated Samaritans and other ethnic groups in Jesus' time. They demanded the local Christians to serve them, since they were the ones who brought divine salvation to these ghastly, condemned people. True, they treated those indigenous priests, pastors, monks, and nuns better than those locals who were not Christians, but they were still low on the rung when it came to wealth, privileges, and power in the mission compounds and institutions. Again, as their home churches did back in their home countries, these mission churches justified racial and other discriminations through theological dogmas. This discrimination was seen in Christian missionaries owning slaves and exploiting the local Christian population in ways to enrich and benefit themselves. The majority of these missionaries also participated willingly and fully in colonial oppression, including consenting to massacring the locals who stood against the colonial power and Christian incursions. The very racism that was present in their home countries were blatantly displayed in these colonies and practiced enthusiastically by many missionaries, especially when the locals refused to convert to Christianity. After all, they saw themselves not as guests, but as agents of the powerful God who condemned all these non-believers of the Western Christianity. If this was the way to make disciples of the people in those colonies, we should have nothing to do with it. We know that making disciples has absolutely nothing to do with establishing a Christian rule where one group of people will discriminate against others based on race and gender, including the gender minorities. The directive to make disciples is not done through actions and activities built on racism. However, sadly, we still see and hear about very evangelically minded fundamentalistic Christians from America and elsewhere who see pagans everywhere headed to hell go to rescue them for Christ's sake, demanding locals in Africa and Asia to convert to Christianity at their beckoning. We probably remember the story of that old retired farmer from the United States who went berserk in an African hotel shouting and beating up a hotel employee, saying that he came to give the gospel and that the employee was not listening to him. This is not an one-off incident. We see many similar behaviors. Here, the demand by that white Christian who saw these Africans as people of lesser races is that he is more powerful and can do anything to them according to his wish, including forcing on the lesser race conversion to a certain type of Christianity. These are the ones who continue to argue that deaths of George Floyd and other blacks at the hands of police are what these blacks deserved since they were part of a sin-filled race. That is, certain Christian sectors still carry this racism and gender discrimination with them everywhere as part of their faithful teachings based on the scriptures. When these Christians talk of making disciples, they mean to make those foreigners to be, talk, think, and behave like them. They shout judgments on the people of their host country as not worthy and sinful. Their converts, too, go to their neighbors and do the same. These new recruits create a hierarchy of discriminations based on these missionaries' notion of the saved or the lost.